Okay, cool. Well, welcome everyone to the second ever Locally Optimistic live Ask Me Anything session. And I'm here today. I'm super stoked to welcome Claire Carroll, coming at us from Fishtown Analytics. Hi, Claire. Welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on. I've got a lot of questions for you. I hope we can keep it into an hour. Some questions are from me. Some questions are from the community. And as always, this will be recorded. We'll throw it up all over the internet, everywhere people could possibly be looking for it. So welcome. I think probably the very best way to get started would be for you to just kind of introduce yourself, sort of tell us something about yourself, where you work now, sort of what kind of stuff you do for fun. Love to hear more about the pizza oven, which we chatted about a little bit just 1 second ago. So please take it away.
Sure. Okay, so my name's Claire. I am the DBT Community Manager at Fishtown Analytics. And I'm also an analytics consultant. So I split my time here at Fishtown between client work and also community managing. I live in Philadelphia. I'm not from Philadelphia, in case you weren't able to tell. I'm from Sydney, and I moved over here 10 months ago for the job. And prior to that, I was an analyst in-house at a startup in Australia called Airtasker.
That's awesome. So how did you find Fishtown? I mean, did you move to Philadelphia to work for them?
I did, yeah. It's kind of a very strange story, but you know, it's a fun thing to try to explain to your grandparents that you're going to work for a company that you met on an internet chat room. But that is essentially what I did. I joined the DBT Slack community in maybe 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that. I'd come across DBT in a blog post that the CEO of Fishtown, Tristan Handy, had written. Mm-hmm. And I loved the blog post, loved everything that they were saying. It just, for me in my role, it made sense in a way that like a lot of the other things I'd been reading in the analytics space hadn't. And the DBT part did not make sense to me at all. I was an analyst who was more comfortable in Excel than SQL. I was using Looker, but not in a very good way.
Sure.
And I was scared of the command line, you know, all these sorts of, Git was like an unknown thing to me. But I sort of just had this trust that if the rest of this article made sense, maybe this idea did too. So I joined the DBT Slack and wrote some really long message, some essay of, you know, this is what I'm trying to do. And in fact, it was, we were using Looker. We wanted to also use Tableau, but we had a lot of business logic locked up in Looker. We needed to move upstream. And so I asked this question of, can DBT help? And for those who don't know, so DBT is a command line tool that basically one of the things it can do is help in this exact scenario. It means that you can pull your business logic into its own repository of code. And so I joined this Slack and said, can DBT do the thing that DBT does? And Drew Matt, the co-founder of Fishtown Analytics, very graciously answered my question with a resounding yes. And over the next year or so, I really went from the analyst that I had just described to one that was working, you know, with Git, in using code editors, understood version control, CI/CD, really like gained a mastery of my field, and a lot of that was from this DBT community that I had joined and had then started contributing back to. So yeah, I moved over to work for a company that I met in an internet chat room.
That's awesome. When you think about that part of your journey, right, like going from someone who is primarily in Excel, like using a lot of you know, graphical interfaces, to somebody who is like not allergic to Git and who is really interested in kind of the more technical side, like, is that something that you sort of took control of yourself? Is that something you had to do for your current job? Like, talk to me about like that part of your journey. What drove that? What was behind that? Because that's not an easy transition, right?
No, it's not at all. I was extremely fortunate in that I worked in a company with a lot of software engineers. So when I said, hey, I need some help with Git, we had a lot of people that were able to help me. So first of all, I was surrounded by people that I could learn those specific skills from. But then I also had this DBT community where I would ask questions like, what warehouses are people using and how do you do event tracking and what is marketing analytics, that were teaching me more the analytics side of things. So the domain knowledge, I should say. So to your point though, like it wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't an easy transition to make. It was a lot of hard work, a lot of getting things wrong, a lot of having to ask, especially on the Git front, having to desperately ask for help because I had no idea what I'd done to my own environment. But I really enjoyed that challenge, and also like I'm a huge fan of project-based learning. So which I think is code for I'm really stubborn with things. So I would set myself tasks and then continue to work at them until they made sense. So yeah, that's how I sort of made that transition.
Do you feel like that transition would have happened if you didn't have both sides of that, right? Both the professional support and the sort of community support?
Ooh, that's a very interesting question. I think I was actually in a very position. I think I needed both of those things for that to work. I think had I been in a company where we didn't have someone who was willing to sit with me and debug problems, that I wouldn't have, learned the technical side of things. So yes, I do think that I needed both sides of that. I was also really fortunate in that I actually came into my last role in an operations role, so definitely a spreadsheet person.
Yeah, of course.
So I was not hired as a data analyst, and moved sideways into the data analyst role. And that was sort of the luck of timing, where one person was leaving the company and I was able to fill that spot. I think if I'd applied for the data analyst role externally, I might not have got it, but being in the right place at the right time, and then seeing the opportunity and asking for it. It's amazing what happens when you ask for things really clearly.
Yeah, when you really kind of step up, right? Like raising your hand. It's for sure. That's something that has become more apparent to me, I think, too, in the last year or so.
Yeah.
Kind of working out loud in that way. It's it's funny that the DBT community is sort of features so prominently in your own story, in your own journey. When I think about our interactions, when I think about how I know Claire, when I think about how I know you, it's primarily through similar communities, right? Through Locally Optimistic, our hosts, thanks again, everybody, and the DBT Slack. And I wonder, like, what is it about community, right? Like, what is it about like the data and the analytics community? I mean, does every type of job have these communities? I don't know. I mean, what is your sense of that? Like, do you feel like we have a healthy level of community and collaboration? Do you feel like it could be better? Like, what's your sense of that? I'm asking you because this is how we know one another, right? Like how we interact. And also it's at least something that you spend a lot of time thinking about, I bet, given you're a community manager for this kind of newish open source movement. So it feels like you probably have a lot to say.
I don't know if I have a lot to say. I have a few things to say. So part of the question was, are we sort of doing well at this or in a unique position? Or why do we have these communities in the first place? And
actually, that's not what I asked, but it's way better. That's a way better question.
I don't know. This is,
yeah.
So I think the reason that we have these communities and why they're so strong is the nature of the analytics field at the moment is that there are a lot of people working in one-person teams. I was one of them. I was, classic data team of one. And the reason for that is the data stack in the last few years has evolved such that one person can actually be an entire data team for quite a sizable period for a company. And as a result, that means there's a lot of people who don't have someone in their company that they can learn from. And so when you join one of these communities, what you actually also get is the opportunity to learn from people who are maybe 6 months ahead of you, 12 months ahead of you. In fact, one of the most meaningful interactions I had very early on was, I think I'd written some self-deprecating thing of like, I'm not a code person. I don't know what's happening. And someone DM'd me and they said, everything that you've described was me from 6 months ago. And so I think these data communities, both DBT and Locally Optimistic, are providing opportunities for people to like interact with those that are slightly ahead and slightly behind, like not, I shouldn't say slightly behind, but like just at different points on the same paths. And when you can make connection with someone that's sort of going through a similar thing to what you're about to go through, or what similar learning curves, it just makes the whole process a whole lot less daunting. I also think that like on the DBT side, the reason that I sort of started to become very involved in the community was just out of a sense of real gratitude. I knew that I would not have progressed in my career in the same way, and made a very conscious decision to say, okay, well, now it's my turn to give back to that community, which led to sort of writing a few discourse articles, which led to a few other things, which eventually led to flying halfway across the world.
Wow, that's awesome. And I feel like as members of this community, like for me, right? Like if you were to say to me specifically, like Simon, here's what an excellent member of this community looks like. Right? Like, what does that look like? Because I feel like there are a lot of folks who gain value from, find utility in these conversations, and maybe don't contribute that much, or maybe aren't sure how to contribute.
Sure.
That's definitely me. I'm literally describing myself. Like, how do I be better? Like, how can I be a better member of that community?
That is such a good question, and one that I've been thinking about a little bit. I mentioned before this call that I'm heading back to Sydney, and so for a few weeks. So I'm going to be in a different time zone, and it's meant that I've had to write down what tone we use when answering Slack questions, because I'm not going to be doing it for the next few weeks. And what this really landed on was sort of a values-based thing, values-based answer. And some of the things that we came up with were, always show empathy. So when someone's asking a question in DBT Slack, we don't necessarily always provide them the answer straight away. We sometimes try to understand the problem that they're solving, because quite often people ask a question where they're trying to solve a symptom rather than actually solving the cause of the problem. So we always put ourselves in their shoes and go, okay, well, what are they trying to do here? Why are they trying to do this? And ask more questions about that. The other thing that we also really value is using things as a teaching opportunity. We have a non-zero number of times when people have problems with their path variable, which is a thing that, if you have never learnt it, is a very confusing thing to debug. And it's very easy to just say, okay, like, here's how you fix it. And we really value, using that as an opportunity to teach someone along the way of, okay, well, this is what a path variable is, and this is, why you have this variable, and how you should use it, so that then next time they hit the same problem, they understand why it happened, and can, maybe help someone else on their own team or help someone else in Slack in the future. So I think those are the two values that we really think about in the DBT community, is empathy and teaching. And that's, I think, been a big part of our success as a community.
And that piece that really rings out to me, right, is this idea of educating and not just answering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because if you don't really understand sort of the root cause behind the problem you're seeing, and you're just kind of cleaning up the problem, then the problem is going to happen again, and maybe in a different flavor and an unfamiliar way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have, guidelines on the other side as well, of if you're asking for help, to make sure that you're asking your question in a way that demonstrates that you've already tried to, answer the question yourself and told us, this is what I've tried so far, and here's where I'm getting stuck, and this is why I'm trying to do the thing. So it's really a two-way street. If we don't always provide the answers straight away, because we want to use it as a teaching moment. But at the same time, if someone is asking for help without demonstrating that they've really given it a go themselves, we'll often ask them to try something else first, and then maybe come back to the question once they've given a few more things.
Sure. A little skin in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get it, for sure. When you think about going back to Australia, and you think about sort of the time you spent in the States, how are those communities different? What is is there a software engineering culture that's different in Australia? I don't know.
it's
experience of that?
Specifically in the software engineering culture, it's very different. One of the most amazing things that I found when I started at Fishtown Analytics was this first meeting that I had where we went around and every analyst on the team talked about their clients and what they were working on with their clients. And the first thing they had to do was describe what the client does. And I sat there and I was like, really? There's a business for that? So I think just the tech scene in the US in general, there's so much venture capital money floating around that you end up with a lot of businesses. And it's not the same in Australia. We don't have we don't have as many startups, I'd say. And the other thing that is really notable to me, and especially from my perspective, is I'm very much like at Fishtown Analytics, I'm the only Australian. In this entire co-working space, I'm the only Australian. When I go to a DBT meetup, I'm often the only non-American.
Sure.
In Sydney, our tech scene is full of people from other countries. We have a massive undersupply of people with engineering backgrounds, and we lose a lot of good people over to the States as well because the salaries are super competitive. At my last company, we actually had 40% of our workforce on visas. And we also have a visa, a regulatory environment that supports that in a different way. So that's one of the other things that I definitely felt when I moved over was sort of the cultural diversity in terms of international culture in the different companies. Heading back to Sydney, I think I'll pick up some things the other way, things that I hadn't noticed before, which now will seem strange to me. So I'll report back on that in a few weeks.
Okay, very good. I appreciate it. I'll be looking out for the report. And, we spoke a little bit about your journey, like coming up to today, right? Sort of where you've come from and the mechanisms that you engage with in order to sort of have the journey that you wanted to have. What about the looking forward, right? Like what are you looking forward to? Like, how are you engaging in sort of becoming better or leveling up?
That is a really good question, and one that I am actually discussing with my manager right at the moment. Well, not this very moment, but at the moment. And there's so many different paths that I guess we can go down in this role. Being a community manager was not the next step that I thought I was going to take, but it was the opportunity with this company was perfect. So I don't have a clear answer for that question. And it's something that I'm actually putting a lot of thought into at the moment. I could go down the sort of learning more on the data engineering side or really honing my writing skills and ability to speak at meetup presentations, all these sorts of things. So that is, and I think that's fine as well. I think in my career, I've definitely gone through different phases of sort of, generalist and, diverging and then specialist and sort of going deep on one thing.
Sure.
So at the moment, I think I'm in a bit of a phase of trying, learning lots of different skills and at the same time, and then maybe over the next few months, we might choose one particular thing that we're really going to hone in on.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and it's you have seasons, and this season you're feeling more like a light bulb and less like a laser beam. Yeah,
I like that. Another thing that we used to talk about in my last role was like hiring people with like a T shape.
Yeah.
So they have skills across a lot of different things, a lot of different areas, but can go really deep in one particular area. And so that's the thing I think about as well. I think at the moment I'm currently working at the top of the T rather than on the.
Yeah. That's what. Yeah, it's like I have a T-shaped skill set except for the part in the middle. I got the rest of it. That's I dig that. I totally dig that. And I think it's okay, especially in the way that data and analytics feels like right now, which is that things are in flux. It feels like things are. And I think an indicator is that if you have a lot of one-person teams, that means there's a lot of new teams.
Yeah, I think it's really, this scene is changing a lot around us. I could not have described what I don't think the things that I do on a day-to-day basis would have been possible in with the tech stack that we had a few years ago. So it's very hard to predict what the future will look like.
Right. Yeah. More DBT though, of course.
Of course, yes.
So help me pitch DBT to my mom. Like how you must talk about it to people who don't understand it all the time.
Yeah.
So what's the pitch, right? And why this is the part that I'm really interested in, right? Like coming out of Automatic, coming out of a company that's super dedicated to open source as an idea and as just like a way of doing business. It's always great and heartening to me to see new projects that are really useful and sort of existing in the same kind of space. So yeah, I mean, can you help me understand this? Why does it exist and why is it open source? Like, it seems like it doesn't have to be, but it's great to do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the first part of pitching is always establishing context. So understanding how much people know. So if I'm talking to someone at a Looker meetup, it's usually a very different conversation because they have the reference point of, say, a PDT as opposed to explaining to my parents what I actually do. Two very different things of trying to explain DBT. But in the general case, DBT was really born out of a changing data stack. If we look back a few years ago, data engineers were responsible for extract, transform, and load, ETL processes, which meant that they had to write the code to hit an API, get those results, hold those results into memory, turn them into usually Kimball-style models, dimension tables, fact tables, and then load them into a data warehouse. And that meant that data consumers on the other side could answer questions. Usually analysts were these consumers on the other side. So if a business wanted to know how much sales they had the data that showed them that. If they wanted to understand the efficiency of their customer support team, they should have the data to do that. Basically, answering any questions with data was the role of the analyst, and the data engineer was responsible for getting that data to the analyst. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of that change. We have extract, and so instead of extract, transform, and load, a lot of companies are using the extract, load, and transform architecture. So products like Stitch and like Fivetran, they're responsible for hitting these APIs and loading data into your data warehouse. And they do a much better job of it than I could ever do. They know how to handle when you get an error and how to send emails and Slack notifications, all those things. So those products are in charge of that. And then on the other side, you've got BI tools, which are empowering users to hopefully be able to answer their own questions. So when they want to know what's the efficiency of my support team, they can find the answers to that in the data themselves. But there's this gap in the middle. I just talked about, sales and, say, customer support. Those two things might come from two different source systems. And they're often loaded into a data warehouse in this sort of source conformed structure. They map very closely to the underlying data model that the app, maybe it's Zendesk, actually uses. And those structures usually aren't optimized for analytical reporting. If you want to know, maybe you have a question like, did a positive customer support experience mean that my customers were more likely to purchase on my platform again? That actually requires joining through two different data sources. And so DBT sort of fills this gap in the middle, where before the BI tools were trying to fill this, where you would have to write the query that does all these things, and one data source loads the timestamp as created at, and the other one's created date, and one's called user ID and one's called customer ID. DBT provides this transformation layer in the middle between the extract and load processes and the BI tools, where as an analyst, as me, my last role as myself as a consultant now, I can do all my data modeling in DBT by just writing select statements, so SQL queries, select statements, and DBT actually turns those select statements into views and tables in my warehouse so that my reporting tools can connect to those beautifully clean data sources, and it means that my consumers on the other side, so now often in product and in marketing and in finance rather than dedicated data analysts, they can more easily navigate the data that they have access to. That was a very long-winded one, but I thought I'd go through it.
No, that's great. It really, the hard part there is the gap, right? Like identifying the problem that exists.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of folks working in data organizations, especially, it's really easy to kind of assume that what you have is the static state, right? Like this is it. Like the problems that we have, we've got to figure out how we can work around them.
Yeah.
He in some ways like elegantly just removes this like block that I think a lot of folks just had cemented in their mind and in their process.
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke before about being a data team of one for quite a while, and then we had a data scientist and a marketing analyst, and then we had a data lead join in my last team, and he had previously been a data engineering lead and had rolled a lot of these processes of writing the code to hit the APIs and return the load data into your warehouse. And I remember him joining the company and just going, wow, like this is, you sort of sticky taped all this together. That's the right word here. Sticky taped all this together and it's working, it's not perfect, but it was working, and I was able to manage the whole thing end to end. And that sort of goes back to this data team of one that we were talking about a bit earlier.
Yeah, and it's really cool to see this proliferation of tools which are starting to remove a lot of what we assume are permanent bottlenecks, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned like Stitch and Fivetran, like same kind of thing, right? The idea is how do you lower the need for technical expertise to get from a data lake to actionable insights? Yeah, it's an exciting time to be doing this work. Absolutely. And you mentioned before kind of the way that Fishtown sort of works with many clients at once, and it seems to me like that's a little bit of, for all y'all sort of working on that team, that seems like a little bit of a superpower. Okay, what do I mean when I say that? I mean, I work with one data team, and it's my data team. And so everything I know about is bounded by the experience of this single team. Whereas when you have the opportunity to work with many different companies, many different organizations, and many different teams, you start to accumulate sort of cross-team insights, probably at a pace that like an individual working at many different places would never be able to. And I was hoping you could talk to that a little bit, sort of speak to almost like what are the real green flags, right? Like when you talk to someone at one of these organizations, like what is an indicator that it's going to be a really successful relationship?
Okay, that is such a good question. Just the first bit of that of, we get to see a lot of like how a lot of data teams are solving problems, even just on like the modeling side of things. We understand how marketing attribution works across many different companies. Very much a superpower, and a thing that I think we are fantastic at, because had I in-house, that was a problem that I didn't know how to solve, and now I've got a whole team of people who are experts at that. So that's really amazing. To the point of what are the green flags, I think, and I really like that phrase of like, what are the signs that it's going to go well? I think the first thing is buy-in. When we have clients where sort of the CTO and the VP of product, or whatever the role is really bought into this change, that's absolutely the first green flag. I also think it's really good. We often work with companies that they don't have a dedicated hire. They don't have a dedicated hire for data, and we are their first sort of people in there who are setting up their data stacks. And that's really fun because we absolutely get to sort of set everything up in the way that we really like. And we then sometimes go and help them hire their first data person. And the green flags that we look for when we're hiring data people is not specifically an experience with the data stack that we are used to working with. In fact, when we hire internally, we also don't necessarily hire for experience in a data stack. The green flags for us are people who ask really interesting questions and who are interested in finding the answer and interested in learning. Because the data stack that we're working in requires a lot of learning because it's so new to so many people. It's not, it's changing all the time. And so finding when we have clients who are really invested in having their team skill up and learn, that's usually a really good sign for us too.
That's awesome. And that must just be such a treat to kind of come in and be able to start from zero.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what does that look like? Like, what does that ideal stack look like?
For me, my preferred stack, I think this is the rest of organizations too. So extract and load tools, Stitch and Fivetran, depending on the connectors that you need and the volume of your data. They have different pricing structures. So it depends on that. Loading into a Snowflake warehouse. I've worked a lot with Redshift, and Redshift was the catalyst for this entire change through the analytics stack. And it was amazing tech, but now we prefer Snowflake a little bit more. It just removes a bit of the overhead of thinking about solving data engineering problems, because time spent thinking about data engineering problems is expensive. So we like Snowflake a bit better. We'll often implement Snowplow for event tracking, and to have records of page views and different click events, things like that. Load that into Snowflake as well, and then DBT, of course. And then have everything feeding into, my preference is Looker. That's just my background though. We happily work amongst most of the BI tools, as long as it's sort of a SQL-based BI tool.
Right. So in looking at so many organizations and seeing so many like ways of success, and even thinking about your own journey, like how would you mentor one of these people who is a team of one? Right? Like A, how should they be thinking about becoming better? And B, like what is the second job, right? Like if that's your first job as a data analyst, like what do you look for next? I mean, should you stick around and like grow until the organization like grows beneath you? Should people be like sniffing around? What's your sense of that?
Ooh, I think that's very specific to the environment that the data analyst is in. So I think there is so much to grow. And in fact, like we're now talking about this different role of going from analyst to analytics engineer, as Michael Kaminsky has coined the term. And that's a term that we like to use as well. And I think that's sort of the career path that I myself went on. Even though my role title was data analyst, I would now, in hindsight, apply that role to myself. And I think that's where we sort of mentor a lot of people, a lot of our, the first hires of a client of ours, we sort of train them up into that role as well.
I wonder, what is it about 2019 that is such a moment for this idea of like the analytics engineer? Have we always had like a need for this person and we've just never named it? Or is this a new kind of need that's starting to arise?
Yeah, I think we haven't always had this term. In fact, I gave a presentation last year internally, I think it was, and I wrote that I was a data something on my like first slide. I used to write over analyst, but changed to data something. And because I didn't know what to call myself, I wasn't a data analyst. I wasn't building reports for people. And I think this analytics engineer role does fill the gap for those companies who use the stack that we just described. And I think the difference between companies that have this role opening up, or have analysts that are stepping into this role, and the companies that sort of stick with it, with having data analysts do a lot of the actual insights work, is how empowered the rest of the business are to be able to answer their own questions. So if your finance team is relying on an analyst to answer their questions, that analyst is going to get stuck in sort of what I call like a service role, where it's tickets in, tickets out, focusing on throughput. And they just sort of feel like they're stuck in this hamster wheel. Whereas if your finance team, is presented with a BI tool that they can understand and they feel like they can get the answers reliably to their questions, maybe with a bit of training, and you fill in that role of training them. But the data that you've presented to them has really been designed and thought, like the user experience of consuming that data has been really thought out. Then those, the people in those roles are sort of leveling up to work on more interesting projects, and projects that don't feel so much like they're on that hamster wheel. They've sort of scaled themselves in a way that I guess software engineers really frequently do, but I think in the past analysts hadn't, and now they can with the framework, the data stack that we're working in.
Yeah, for sure. It does feel like it's a little bit of part of the data stack, right? Part of what the modern tooling is allowing people to kind of fill in the space that they weren't able to before.
Yeah. One of my more fun projects at the moment is working with an old school extract, transform, load. I have to actually think about it every time I say these in the right order. Extract, transform, load pipeline. And one of the really cool things is that I haven't done that before. I didn't come from that background and have to unlearn a lot of the things that people, learnt maybe a decade ago or so, or maybe even 7 or 8 years ago. And now I'm learning them, and I'm very grateful for the tech stack that we currently have, because it's like, oh my gosh, I don't have to think about truncating tables and inserting records and creating views and schemas if they don't already exist. It's just a thing that I just don't have to think about.
Yeah.
So yeah, as an analyst that was working in this tech stack, I was really just empowered to focus on what I was very good at, which was writing select statements and, representing the business that I was working in terms of data, as opposed to thinking really hard about making sure that my create schema, if not exists, statements were correct.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Better. This is better. We live in the future, and it's a nice place to live. You touched on something that has been on my mind a lot lately. So I'm not the locally optimistic AMA interviewer full time. I do have an additional professional obligation, and one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is this idea of the user interface and the user experience, right, for my colleagues. And the way that you refer to it as a way of like scaling myself is really interesting. And I'm hoping you can maybe talk a little bit about like what are the best practices for that, right? Like how can those of us who are in this role like present the best interface? Like what are the really good patterns that you've seen or that you all pursue?
Yeah. The first thing that I would always say is start at the right-hand side of the DAG. So when people really think about data transformations, and when I was describing the tech stack, we really work from left to right in terms of how do you get your data in and then how do you get it into your BI tool. When I'm actually working with a client, we start at the other end when we're working with their stakeholders, and we say, what are the questions that you're trying to answer at the moment, that the ones that you feel that you aren't able to answer. And from that, we sort of design a data model, which sounds, it's a very easy sentence to say, but it takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of, I'm very fortunate in that I work with a lot of people that have solved similar problems before, so that we kind of have like the cheat sheet in terms of what the answer will look like. But it's starting at the end of the process and saying, if we had access to everything and didn't have to worry about that, what is the thing that we'd want to design? And so design thinking essentially. And then things like, what is this column called, becomes really important, whereas before it was sort of a throwaway thing. And the documentation that you can provide to users, the people say that the best code is self-documenting, but there's some things when you need to describe the differences between pending, return pending and returned that self-document, good labels may not cover. So good documentation really helps there. And so when I'm working with a client, we design these data models and think about what we name things and making sure it's meaningful and navigable, and things are ordered, things are in really nice structures, that you use your schemas really well in your data warehouse. And this communication, how I disseminate knowledge to the rest of the team becomes the really important step of the data modeling flow. And I'm now actually at the point where when I work with DBT, I actually mock my final data structure and sort of hook up Looker to that and build the dashboards. It's actually even better, I should say, if you can start with the dashboards and then work back to the data model that feeds the dashboards. So I'll mock it and, you know, sort of build the user interface and then work backwards to the source data to say, okay, well, if we're building a record of trips, you know, for if we're, you know, Lyft or Uber, what's the source data that I have available to me to fill that in? And I've really found that process is really useful in figuring out like what is the parts of my design that describe, you know, the parts of the process which describes a business. You know, what is a trip in a business sense? If a user opened up their phone and they hit cancel within 30 seconds, is there actually a trip? Well, my source system may have a record for that trip, but when I'm thinking from like my users' experience, the internal users who are trying to navigate this data, to them, that's not a trip. So I'm not going to include it. So yeah, really putting myself in, starting at that end of the process and working backwards to the source data. And sometimes I'll, you know, if I'm like, this is a thing we want later, we'll put the column in, just fill it with nulls for now and say, we'll come back to this. So yeah, that's my process there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I really like how you've sort of centered it on the expectations of the final user, right? And not necessarily centered it on what do we have, like what do we have in the typical, right? And how do we get it in?
This can be a really hard conversation when you're working with a company that is used to sort of having an analyst where they can say, I need a list of all the people that I need to send an email marketing list to. Send a marketing email to. And they're used to getting the CSV back. And instead saying, hold up, I'm actually working on, you know, I have a roadmap that I'm working on and I can't fill requests straight away. And instead I'm going to teach you how to do this. And what else do you want to know about these users? It can feel quite strange to businesses who aren't working in that paradigm. And especially if you have business users who know enough SQL to be dangerous, they'll often say, well, I'll just write the query. And then suddenly everyone's got different versions of the exact same number, which is a really hard problem to solve. So building trust into your data sets as well is an important part of that process.
So, you know, you spoke a little bit about the, you know, the dreaded hamster wheel, kind of finding yourself in a service role. How do you know if that's where you're at, and how do you get out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been there, and the way that I felt it was, I felt like I didn't have the bandwidth, as in the number of hours in the day, nor did I have the knowledge, nor did I have the authority to get out of that hamster wheel at the time. And instead was, you know, as soon as I finished one thing, there was just that backlog that kept piling up. And it took, you know, a real shift in priorities to be able to say, actually, we are going to build a thing instead, and we're not, you know, we balanced the two for a while. Yeah, so it's, I think that's just how, when you feel like the backlog just never shrinks it, and like, you know, from a career perspective, when you're in that position, it can feel really tough as well, because you feel like you stop learning, and you stop getting to work on the really interesting projects. So yeah, I think those are often the telltale signs. Also, if you're just if you feel like you're a bottleneck to the rest of the company, if they want any answers, they have to go through you. That's just a really hard thing to scale. Every extra question is extra work, and then the thought of bringing on a new person and, you know, transferring that knowledge to them is also really daunting, because it's all sort of in your head, and that in itself is a huge undertaking. So scaling that sort of service role is nearly impossible. You sort of are just generating
organizational and technical debt just every day.
Yes. Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think we're coming up to the end here, and I would like to just open it up. If there's anybody kind of on the call now who would like to ask a question, you can go video if you like. If you'd like to put it in the chat box, I can read it and try to present it as well. So now is the time to kind of do that. If you're ready, just let us know if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, I'll keep asking, because I've got a lot more questions, Claire. And I think the big question that's on everyone's mind is how or where can we get left join or die t-shirts?
Oh my goodness. So those who joined the call really early will see that the co-founder of Fishtown, Drew Bannon, was wearing the same t-shirt as me, and these are a Drew Bannon special. He created a dozen of them, and there was one on my desk on my first day when I started here. Dylan Baker, I don't know who's joined in. Dylan Baker also has one, and a few other people. So I think you have to send Drew a message for those.
So if we see them, that's how you know somebody is in the Bannon mafia. They're on the inside.
It's a very niche joke. I didn't understand it when I first got it. I was like, cool, it's a snake. So yeah, it's we're in Philadelphia, the birthplace of modern democracy, as some would say, and we're a data company in Philadelphia. So let's go for a very niche joke that combines the two.
Well, I like it. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Being
jokes are the best.
like being in Philadelphia, can you talk about cheesesteaks? Like, do you have a favorite? Are you willing to steak a?
I've had a total of 2 cheesesteaks since moving over here. One was on my second night. It was at Joe's Cheesesteak in Fishtown, and the other was at Sonny's cheesesteaks. And I don't know. I think there's a reason I've only had 2. I'm so sorry. They're probably going to kick me out now for this.
Very dramatic. Very dramatic of you.
Not my favorite food, I'm afraid.
So one of the questions in the chat as well is, when you think about not the companies that you go into and they're total blank slate, when you think about the companies that you have to go in and engage in a little bit of corrective action, are there any corrective actions that you feel like you just got to over and over? Are there things that people should think about in just avoiding in their own stacks?
That's an interesting one. This is going to be a controversial one and may not be endorsed by my coworkers. We'll see. I think a big mistake is having a data team that reports to finance or operations. And I think that's a very common pattern for organizational design for the last however long tech's been around. And the reason that I think that is because I really see building data pipelines as a product team where you have to, as we talked before, design thinking and think about your users. And so I was on a data team that reported to the CTO, and I really liked that. I think we could have easily have reported to the VP of product, because it sort of gives you that bandwidth to think about building a product rather than just answering questions. So, I mean, I'm sure that's my very hot take, potentially.
Great take.
That's one thing that I see that I would, if I was setting up from scratch, that would be my advice. In terms of going into companies and trying to take corrective action, I don't know. Every company is a snowflake. Very few are on Snowflake.
For sure, I get that. And the organizational design question too, especially folks who are in the locally optimistic Slack, which everyone should be, strongly endorsed. A lot of positive talk about community today. There is actually an org design channel, which has been a real source of wisdom for me. It's a lot of the same kind of question, right? Where should the data organization sit? I
think I do, and a light bulb has popped above my head about the biggest mistake. I would say companies that overcomplicate their infrastructure. That is a huge mistake. Or companies that try to roll their own when they don't need to. I worked with a client recently that had a very good Redshift cluster. They hired a new data engineer, and the data engineer said, why don't we just have this in a MySQL database? And let's put it on. Why are we paying for Fivetran? Let's roll our own. I can write my own scripts to hit the APIs and put data into the warehouse. And so that for me is a huge red flag. We're talking about green flags. So this one's definitely a red flag when there's engineers that would want to build their own thing as opposed to buying off the shelf.
For sure. Yeah, it's something we've been talking about a lot lately within the Slack community is this idea of autonomy and how autonomy can kind of cut both ways, right? Like you could imagine, oh, well, we want to be maximally autonomous, so we want to write all of our own API connectors.
Yeah.
But then you could also see it the other way, which is, well, in order for us to be maximally autonomous and to gain the most utility, everything we can export to an outside service.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, this is a pretty common paradigm in software engineering, which is, you should write code that is about what makes your business unique. Don't build your own payments platform because Stripe's really good at being a payments platform. And so I think it's the same in analytics. Focus on what makes your business really unique. We did been part of some really cool projects about, the things that make our platform unique and how we handle that from a data engineering perspective and how we got collaboration across teams. But the whole while we were using off-the-shelf products as well. So I think that's, and there is a point in a company's journey where it doesn't make sense for them to use off-the-shelf products. Maybe they're prohibitively expensive, or open source products. Maybe they do need to roll their own for whatever reason. But that's a scaling point as opposed to the starting point. And I think one of the reasons why this happens is because you hear so much about what the Googles or the Pinterests or the Instagrams or whatever they're doing. Pinterest recently wrote an article which was saying, we built this distributed Kafka, something Hadoop, something system. I genuinely can't read through these articles. And there was a great tweet that said, because Pinterest did it, it means you shouldn't, unless you have any time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I think that really drives the point home. We hear a lot about what the big companies are doing, and we think, well, it's good enough for Google, it's good enough for me, but in fact, it's usually the opposite way around. It's well, if it's good enough for Google, then what are the alternatives that I can handle as a one-person team?
But then you're never going to get on Hacker News.
No, never. Never ever. But I think the most successful data teams that we've worked with have, had not tried to reinvent the wheel and have used used products that filled that space really effectively.
Cool. Well, Claire, let me give you the last word. Is there anything in particular you'd like to mention or shout out, sort of as we come to an end here?
No, that's really a blank slate is a scary one. No, we have a meetup on Wednesday in New York, which a DBT meetup, which we will have the Zoom link going out for that soon. I'm really excited. We have speakers from Lyft, Rent the Runway, and Casper, and it's at Casper. So I'm really looking forward to that. And also, if you aren't yet following DBT on Twitter, our handle is GetDBT. Have to get that plug in. We also have a YouTube channel, so all the plugs at the end here.
Of course.
But yeah, if anyone's sort of watching this and they haven't played around with DBT, highly encourage you to give it have a look at it. We have some demonstration projects up as well. Join our community, say hi, let us know how you found it, and generally join to say hi and stick around for the terrible data puns that happen every so often in there. Yeah. Right
on. Well, that sounds great. Claire, thank you so much. We'll have another AMA at the end of August, yet to be scheduled, but it will be scheduled soon. If you have anyone that you think would be a great fit, let me know. Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you, Claire, and thanks again to our hosts at Locally Optimistic. All right.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.